Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming to the last pair of lectures, the last pair of Keynote lectures in the WEP theme on food and farming, celebrating the United Nations International Year of Family Farming. It's very suitable for our last international lecturer, who's come today from Rome, because she's from the United Nations. An official of the United Nations, and we're very privileged to have her here today. Terri Raney is our speaker this evening. She's the program leader and chief editor of the State of Food and Agriculture, which is the premier flagship publication of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, the FAO. Dr. Raney earned a PhD from Oklahoma State University in agricultural economics with a focus on international trade and development. Prior to assuming editorship of the State of Food and Agriculture, she worked as a trade policy economist with a few organizations, including the FAO, the United States Department of Agriculture, and Washington State University. This publication that Dr. Raney edits is very influential, and recent editions of the State of Food and Agriculture have shaped global policy debates on nutrition, gender, sustainable livestock systems, and agricultural biotechnology. Dr. Raney also publishes regularly in peer-reviewed books and journals on topics related to science in society. And so without any further ado, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce Dr. Raney, who's going to talk to us about feeding the 9 billion sustainably and why science and technology are not enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mark. I am absolutely delighted to be here. This is my first time in Saudi Arabia, and thank you. It's my first time here, and I'm just delighted. Everyone has been so gracious. It's a pleasure to be here. So as Mark said, I am with the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, based in Rome. I'm the editor of the State of Food and Agriculture. What you see here is a celebration of 65 years of the State of Food and Agriculture. The very first edition of the report was published in 1947. And so in 2012, we went back and had the full collection digitized. And so they're now available on our website in all the languages that the report is produced in. So French, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, and now Russian, as well as English, of course. So I'm the latest in a long line of SOFA editors. I've worked on the 10 reports listed here. My first real involvement in technology issues was in 2004 when we published Agricultural Biotechnology, Meeting the Needs of the Poor. Now I'm an agricultural economist. What do I know about technology? And I thought, oh sure, I can do a report on that. It was a real education, and I haven't stopped learning about it since. So one of the reasons Mark invited me to come is that with the State of Food and Agriculture, we take a broad view of development issues, and we try to embed them really in the socioeconomic system in which agriculture is operating. And he asked me to talk about the challenges of feeding the world sustainably. And so what are those challenges? Well, you know them quite well. FAO and the United Nations system as a whole is very concerned about undernourishment and hunger in the world. And we declared back in 1990 our intention to help countries cut the number of undernourished people by half by the year 2015. Well, as you can see from that upper line, the yellow line, we're not meeting that goal. We are not meeting the goal. We're doing better in proportionate terms. So the proportion of undernourished people is down to about 15%. That still seems unconscionably high, but if you think about historic terms, in 1947, the very first edition of the State of Food and Agriculture estimated that half the world's population was malnourished. And so in that 65, 67-year period, we've gone from half to about 15%. So you can be an optimist or a pessimist. Still, it's quite unconscionable that almost 1 billion people are severely undernourished. In addition, what we see are very stark regional disparities in progress. So here you see in sub-Saharan Africa, the number of undernourished people has actually increased during the period since 1990. But there's been massive progress in Southeast Asia and East Asia. Okay? Additional progress in Latin America. Very little change in South Asia. Now, keep these trends in mind because they'll come back to us as we go through the presentation. In addition to undernourishment, we now have very much more complex malnutrition problems than we had in 1947. In 1947, it was hunger, pure and simple. Now it's more complex. We have about 80 countries in the world that still have childhood stunting rates in excess of 20%. Now, what is stunting? Stunting means that a child has been so poorly nourished and so ill in its early life, in its first 2 to 5 years of life, that it will never be able to grow properly, will never reach his full potential physically or mentally. It's estimated that one child in four in the world is stunted. That's a scandal. Meanwhile, micronutrient deficiencies remain very widespread. About 140 countries in the world have childhood vitamin A deficiencies or anemia in excess of 20%. Again, these are serious developmental problems. We're wasting a huge potential when that many children are malnourished. At the same time, almost 75 countries have growing obesity and overweight problems. Adult obesity rates in excess of 20%. And of course, you all know the health problems associated with obesity. But what's really a thorny problem is that these problems overlap. Okay? There are countries, there are actually households and even individuals who suffer from all three forms of malnutrition. Now you say, how can someone be stunted and obese? Well, actually, children who are stunted and severely malnourished in their early life may have a greater propensity to obesity as they age if they move into a more affluent, a more abundant situation. So it's a really thorny problem, not so easy to solve. You know, in 1947, the answer was increase production. Now the answer has to be more complex. Just for interest, Saudi Arabia is one of the 40 countries that still has high levels of child micronutrient deficiencies and adult obesity. At the same time, we're facing a world in which population is projected to grow to over 9 billion by the year 2050. Many of these people will be increasingly affluent, and they'll be demanding diets that are higher quality, more meat, more vegetable oils, a higher nutrient-dense diet, which is good, but a higher environmental cost for production. Meanwhile, agricultural ecosystems around the world are at risk. Many of these ecosystems, some are real breadbaskets of the world, so the Great Plains of the United States, the real rice bowls of Asia are at risk, but also areas where millions of very vulnerable people already live, so coastal plains, areas where people are already living on the margin, and they're likely to be even more at risk as we go forward. So the challenge is immense. Science and technology is absolutely essential to addressing these problems. We need to increase agricultural production and productivity. By productivity, we mean farmers produce more with less. Okay? This improves the environmental sustainability of agriculture, but it also improves the incomes of farmers, and that's absolutely critical. We need to learn to use resources more sustainably, to mitigate and adapt to climate change, and somehow we need science and technology to help us address this triple burden of malnutrition. But science and technology are not sufficient. Just a little historical example. So I talked about 1947 and half the world's population being malnourished. The response to that problem was a concerted international effort of agricultural research that came to be known as the Green Revolution, with the introduction of high-yielding varieties of basic staple grains. The Green Revolution occurred primarily through public research, through governments and through foundations. It was aimed specifically at producing public goods, so products that could be made freely available to the public. There was an explicit strategy for international cooperation, international dissemination of these technologies, and that included a very clear strategy for national research capacity development. It was very clear that the international researchers, the international research centers, couldn't just produce these technologies that would be adopted. They had to be adapted and developed for the local conditions in the markets where they were used. As part of in the Green Revolution, during that time period, germplasm was freely shared. Okay? There were no intellectual property rights. There was no Cartagena Protocol on biodiversity. So germplasm flowed very freely. There were very few regulatory hurdles and very little civil society involvement. In fact, the story I've been told is that M.S. Swaminathan met with Indira Gandhi at a time when India was having very severe nutrition problems. They were highly dependent on international food aid flows, and they were trying to solve their agricultural problem. And the story is that Mrs. Gandhi asked Professor Swaminathan if these new varieties of wheat and rice, are they any good? Are they safe? Are they good for India? And he said yes, and she said, let's do it. And that was the end of the decision-making process. We don't have it quite so easy anymore. Even with that very favorable, very easy policy environment and international cooperation, the Green Revolution had some interesting impacts. It absolutely doubled the production of basic grains, and this was fundamental to the economic transformation that has occurred around the world since the 1940s. It had an amazingly positive impact on farm incomes and rural wages in many countries that are dependent on agriculture throughout Southeast Asia, East Asia, Latin America. Okay? This was really transformative. It sparked the economic growth that we've seen around the world. It reduced food prices for consumers all over the world, and some economists actually say that that was the most important impact of the Green Revolution because it kept prices low for consumers. But even with that favorable environment and these very positive technological gains, there were some problems. First, the richest farmers in high potential areas benefited first. Right? They benefited first, and in some cases, farmers in more marginal areas have yet to reap the benefits of the Green Revolution. Particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, there's been very little uptake, relatively little uptake, of Green Revolution varieties, high-yielding varieties. That's beginning to change, but it's been a much more difficult challenge than in Asia and Latin America. In many countries, inappropriate policies promoted inappropriate agricultural practices. So we see problems of soil degradation and water pollution and overuse of pesticides coming out, driven not by the technology per se, but by the policy environment around it. So what do we see with the gene revolution? Okay? It's a very different environment. Okay? First of all, it involves both public but very heavy private sector involvement in the development and commercialization of the products. Okay? So that means these products don't flow as freely as they did before. We also have international regulatory issues around the flow of living modified organisms, GMOs, through the WTO and the CBD that are inhibiting, in some cases, research in a very real way. This more complex legal and regulatory environment means that countries that want to use these technologies have to have a pretty sophisticated national legal system to manage IPRs, to manage contracts. Okay? They also need national research capacity at a pretty sophisticated level and regulatory capacity to be able to answer the questions they need to answer in dealing with it. Markets must function properly because this is a market-based system. And increasingly, civil society is involved in the decision-making. So it's no longer Indira Gandhi and her science advisor deciding to just do it. What's more, and what concerns me personally, is that I don't see any global strategy, no global public sector strategy to address the gaps, to address the problems. But when we look at the technology, it looks like there are some real successes. We're looking at the socioeconomic impacts of, right now I'm looking just at GM crops. Now I know biotechnology is a much broader field than that, but where we have evidence is primarily in the GM crops. So the first sign of success is the rate of adoption, and it has been remarkably rapid. Developing countries actually now exceed industrialized countries in the total area planted to GM crops. So area is growing rapidly. That's a sign to me as a bit of a farmer myself. You know, farmers won't do it if it's not good for them, if they're not benefiting. So there's something is going right for farmers, or you wouldn't see the kind of adoption rates that we've seen. But there are problems. There are still 4 primary crops that account for the vast majority of the area. There are only 2 traits that again account for the vast majority of area. It's beginning to change a little bit, but still those 4 and those 2 are the dominant ones. I was recently part of an assessment done jointly between FAO and the European Commission Joint Research Center in Sevilla to assess socioeconomic methods for evaluating GM crops. And we brought together some of the best researchers in the world in this field, and we had them talk about their research findings and also their evaluation of the methodologies. You know, how reliable do they think their findings are? And so we went through the main crops, and what we see for GM maize is that there have been significant gains in yields. Not huge, but significant for GM maize. As with cotton, the gains are greater in areas that did not previously control for the pests. That makes sense, doesn't it? One of the greatest benefits has been in reduced chemical, energy, and labor use. Okay? And we had some examples of findings from various countries with with returns from Spain, South Africa, and the Philippines, sometimes quite impressively so. South Africa is one of the most interesting cases in this regard because they have a real bimodal distribution in their agricultural sector. They have a few very large, very sophisticated, well-educated, very savvy farmers. And they have about 2 million very small, very poor, limited resource farmers. Okay? And what we see with GM maize is that it's the big farmers who are adopting it. The small farmers, very, very little. Okay? Even though they have a product, they have insect-resistant white maize, so it's the kind of maize that small farmers grow. It's BT or insect-resistant maize. It's the easiest technology for a farmer to adopt because the technology is embodied in the seed. But still, it's not reaching the smallest and the poorest. Interesting case. BT cotton is a little bit different story. It's a very interesting one, and probably the one I know most about personally. I've studied it a bit more than the others. BT cotton, of course, controls for lepidopteran pests, which are a serious problem in cotton production around the world. It has been very rapidly adopted by smallholder farmers, particularly in China and India. And it has had significant positive impacts on chemical insecticide use, on raising effective yields by reducing pest damage, and therefore generating higher incomes for farmers. Now, most of these farmers, these are classic family farmers, they're operating on less than 2 hectares of land, okay? But they're earning an additional $400, $500 per hectare per year, which is huge in these countries. So it's been extremely successful in these countries. The pesticide use is one I like to highlight because it doesn't often get a lot of attention. We've seen an 80% reduction in acute pesticide poisonings in India. And I like to show this picture because it shows what pesticide application is like in many developing countries. You see this fellow is walking through a field. He's got a tank of pesticide, chemical pesticide on his back. He's not wearing any protective gear. There's no face mask. He does at least have long sleeves, but that's about it in terms of protection. And he's got this huge sprayer behind him, and he's walking through the fields. And so he spends his day walking through a cloud of chemical pesticide. And so the social benefits of reducing that exposure is really quite important. Farm-level impacts of herbicide-tolerant soybeans. This is another little bit different story. It's used primarily in North America and South America, typically by larger farmers. It has been very successful. It's ascribed with a number of benefits for the farmers themselves in terms of weed control, convenience, reliability. It is credited with some significant environmental benefits in terms of promoting no-till agriculture, so improving quality of soil. It has enabled double cropping with maize in Argentina, and this has really been transformative for Argentine agriculture. It uses less labor, toxic chemicals, and energy, but if it's not used properly, it can cause problems. If it's overused year after year after year, the same herbicide leads to herbicide-tolerant weeds. So it's natural evolution. The pests are evolving along with everything else. So really relies on the application of good agricultural practices to maintain the benefits. At the global level, we see a total positive picture in terms of socioeconomic benefits, but there are clear winners and losers, and this is where part of the controversy around these crops come from. We see the biotech and seed companies definitely are benefiting. They're sharing the benefits with farmers about a third. You know, the companies are getting about a third of the economic benefits, farmers are getting about a third, and consumers and processors are getting about a third of the total benefits in the form of lower prices. Losers, competing technology suppliers, don't like this at all, and farmers who don't adopt the technology are losing because these crops are keeping prices low, keeping prices down, and so conventional farmers are getting lower prices for their products as well, without the benefits of increased yields that the adopting farmers are getting. So farmers in countries where these crops are not available or where they don't have the policy environment and the economic incentives to be able to adopt them are being hurt. The level and distribution of impacts really depend on the institutional setting in the country. Okay? What is their regulatory environment like? How strict is their intellectual property rights enforcement? How well are markets functioning? Can farmers actually access the technologies? These issues are really what determine the overall level of benefit in a country and the distribution of the impacts between processors and consumers, farmers, and biotech companies. Global impacts, it is estimated that during the food price spike of 2008 and 9, that GM crops may have kept world prices 10 to 30% lower than they would have been. Okay? So they already doubled. Okay? If it had not been for the yield increases, the productivity gains coming from GM crops, prices would have been even higher. Okay? So there's a gain there as well. So science and technology, definitely essential. This technology is having clear and positive socioeconomic impacts in the countries where they're being used, but they're clearly not enough. Why? This is Hansaben. She's a friend of mine. Hansaben is a farmer in Gujarat, India. And her experience with GM crops is really emblematic of the kind of problems that many very small-scale farmers face. Hansaben is a farmer in her own right. She has less than a hectare of land. She grows a combination of crops, including cotton, and she decided that she would try this new high-tech, biotech GM cotton. And it wasn't doing very well in her field when I visited her. It was kind of shriveled, wasn't growing well. Whereas her conventional cotton in the next field was doing pretty well. And so I asked her, Hansaben, how do you know you're growing GM cotton? I mean, how do you know it really is transgenic? She said, well, you know, she's not sure, but the guy who sold it to her said it was, but it wasn't in a package, it wasn't certified, it wasn't labeled, there was no government guarantee that it was what it said it was. And then I said, so Hansaben, what variety of cotton is this? And she said, oh, I don't know. And I said, do you think it's really adapted to the kind of drought conditions that Gujarat experiences? And she said, well, clearly not, because it's not doing very well. And I said, you know, I'm willing to bet that it's not locally adapted for the growing conditions in her region. And how do I know that? Or what makes me strongly suspect that? It is that the government of Gujarat has put a price cap on GM seeds. Now, this is a very well-intentioned policy. It's meant to protect farmers from being taken advantage of by seed suppliers. But when you put a price cap on a product, you reduce the incentive to produce it. So no company, no seed breeder, no seed company is going to invest in developing a locally adapted variety of cotton for use in Gujarat because they can't get their investment back. So a well-intentioned government policy basically makes it impossible for Hansben to get the kind of seed she needs to be successful with this technology. Now, this seems like a little bit of a segue, and maybe it is, but I want to be very clear that we focus on the central importance of farmers in this picture. Okay? Farmers are the key to successful technology deployment. Okay? Farmers are the largest investors in agriculture in the world. Okay? So we talk about government investment in research and development, in their support to agricultural producers. We talk about public spending on agricultural R&D. That's that third little blip you can hardly even see. Okay? Foreign assistance to agriculture is the fourth little blip. You can hardly see it at all. Foreign direct investment gets lots of coverage in the press. It's tiny, okay, compared to what farmers do themselves. Farmers' on-farm investment is key to agriculture. Okay? Remember we talked about countries that were making progress and not making progress on reducing undernourishment? This chart divides the countries according to their level of on-farm investment. Okay? And clearly the countries in green are those that have made significant progress in reducing hunger in the last 15 years. And they are the ones that have had significant growth in on-farm investment. The middle group, the 25, have made little or no progress, and they've had little or no investment in on-farm capital stock. And 16 countries in this sample actually are going backwards. And this is primarily sub-Saharan Africa. We know that investment in agriculture is important because it increases productivity, it reduces food insecurity. But look at this chart. This shows on-farm investment by region. Okay? So the growth in on-farm investment since 1980 by region, and you see the regions that have made significant progress in reducing undernourishment have had strongly positive on-farm investment. That tiny little one, almost at the end, you can hardly even see the bar, that's South Asia, and they've had zero growth in on-farm investment per farmer since 1980. And sub-Saharan Africa is going seriously, significantly backwards. So farmers are still investing, but the on-farm population is growing so fast. Farms are becoming so fragmented. They have nothing. I mean, so we talk about technology, and we talk about high-tech technology. And it's like, these farmers don't have a hoe. They certainly don't have a plow. They don't have, even the basic tools that are needed. So enhancing the ability of farmers to invest on their own farms is absolutely critical. Final section, a final point I want to make is that women are key to this story. Women are absolutely key to this story. Women are farmers. 43% of agricultural labor in the world is supplied by women. Now, this varies significantly by country and region. Okay? It's much higher in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. It's 50% or even more. Okay? Less in the Near East, but even in the Near East, it's 20%. So women are working in agriculture. Agriculture is very important to them. And they very often are farmers in their own right. Okay? They're not just little women helping their husbands with the kitchen garden. They're serious farmers. But they have a problem. Female farmers produce less than male farmers. Why is that? Are they bad farmers? No, they are not bad farmers. They produce less because they use less. They have smaller farms. Okay? Their land is usually of lower quality than that of men. Okay? These are data from a cross-section of countries showing the distribution of farm size by male and female headed households. So it's a subset of female farmers. But across the board, women's farms are smaller, okay? And they use fewer inputs. This chart represents fertilizer, but we could provide a similar chart for every single thing a farmer needs to be productive. Women have less education. They have less access to credit. They are less likely to use fertilizers. They are less likely to use mechanical equipment. They own less livestock. Let's see, what else does a farmer need? Pretty much everything. Okay? Women have less. And in fact, studies show that the yield gap between male and female farmers is entirely accounted for by this difference in input use. So if we could close that gap in input use, we'd close the yield gap. And what would that mean for the world? Well, closing the yield gap between male and female farmers, okay, just on the land controlled by women. Okay? So remember I said 43% of labor is provided by women. They control much less land. They control a smaller percentage of land. But if just on their land we close the yield gap of 20 to 30%, this could increase production in the developing countries by 2.5 to 4%. Now that may not sound like very much, but it is actually quite a significant gain. And if we put that gain into FAO's formula for estimating the number of undernourished people in the world, what we see is that just closing the gender gap on the land controlled by women could reduce the number of undernourished people by 12 to 17%. So the number of undernourished people, that is equivalent to 100 to 150 million people could be lifted out of hunger just by closing the gender gap. We know, of course, that there are broader social and economic gains that come from increasing the income that's controlled by women. Increase income controlled by women, and you almost automatically get better health outcomes for children, better nutrition and education outcomes for children. And so you're really investing in the next generation. Remember I said one child in 4 is stunted. So this would go a long way to helping that. So what can be done to make science and technology work for society? I could write a laundry list of things that need to be done, but I think there are 4 really key areas. And these are in capacity building and funding for research, regulation, and dialogue at the national level. So developing countries need this capacity themselves. They may not be doing transformations themselves, but they need to be able to do the adaptive breeding that's required. And so a real serious capacity building program is needed, and I think that should happen at the global level. I think there is an urgent need to rationalize the way these technologies are regulated at the international level and at country level. We need to make sure that our regulations are transparent, science-based, and case-by-case, but we also need to make sure they are proportional to the risk. They're proportional to the risk, and I think the situation we're in now is not. So some serious rationalization needs to occur there. It is absolutely fundamental to get policies and market incentives right so that small farmers can invest on their own farms, so that small farmers can adopt new technologies. And one key area is policies to promote gender equality. Unless women in agriculture have the right to control land, have the right to sign a contract, can go to school, can go to the marketplace, they will be forever handicapped, and the world will be handicapped. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Terri, for that presentation. We'll have questions and answers. It was very good to get a balanced or an extra injection into our debate during this week with an analysis on the socio-economic issues that need also to be tackled, not just technologies and not just policies. So thank you very much. Now this talk is open for discussion and questions. I think we should do that now for maybe 10 or 15 minutes.
Good.
So do people have questions for Dr. Raney on her presentation? Yeah, right down the front.
So thank you for a very interesting presentation. You highlighted the key saying this inequality between on females, between male and female farmers, and we need to close that gap. So how do you close that gap? Is that simply by policy and regulation, or are there other avenues or things that need to be considered?
That's a very good question. You know, when I first started working on this gender issue in agriculture, I kept meeting people who said to me, you know, why are you even trying? You know, gender issues, that's culture, and culture doesn't change. And I said, what? You know, culture changes all the time. You know, cultures are constantly changing. And so part of the process is one of policy. Okay? In very many countries, governments effectively have their boot on the neck of women. You know? Women can't own land. Women can't sign a contract. Women get acid thrown in their face if they try to go to school. Okay? Government policy can go a long way to changing that basic legal environment in which people operate. They can also foster cultural change in more organic ways, you know, by fostering education for men and for women. Okay? Because gender is not just about women, it's the relationship between men and women. So education there is very, very much empowering. As women enter the labor force, it's transformative. You know, there's a significant amount of evidence that shows that increasing the relative power of women within a household is absolutely transformative for families. Okay? So a little more education for women, a little more income for women, close the age gap between husbands and wives. Okay? So that, yeah, in areas where you have older men marrying much younger women, okay, it's a significant power imbalance. So close some of those gaps, and women and men, you know, very rightfully take a much more collaborative kind of approach, and it can be transformative.
Is there a role for NGOs in all of this?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I talked about my friend Hanseben, and Hanseben's life really has been changed through her involvement with an NGO called SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association. And this is an organization in India. It came from India. It's an organic homegrown program that basically tries to help women help themselves. So they form cooperative groups for agricultural knowledge, agricultural education. They actually met on Hansaben's front porch. There were 40 women sitting all together, and the Sewa agricultural extension officer was there explaining to them the importance of whatever they needed to be doing at that time. Their mutual savings and lending association. So they teach women how to save, because if you can't save, you can't invest. So teach women how to save, teach women, provide very small loans to women who are trying to start their own businesses. So NGOs have a huge role to play in this regard. They work very sensitively with the local communities. These Sewa is really a model. I think they're fantastic.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. That's positive and encouraging for just sometimes I hear talks like yours and I feel very powerless and I don't know what to do, but if there is something useful by supporting NGOs, that's what a lot of us ordinary sort of Westerners can still do. That's good. I was wondering about all of these indicators being so negative in Africa. Why is that? Is it fundamental issues like Africa's got the poorest soils on the planet, or is it because of breakdown of governance in so many countries in Africa?
Yes.
Can you give any insight to that?
Yes. I think compared, I won't go too far into the science, but you'll help me out with this. Compared with East Asia, agronomic conditions in Africa are much more diverse and much more challenging.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah? Many more crops are grown in Africa. It's not, you can't say rice is our it's our I would say our rice bowl crop. There's not a single bread basket or rice bowl crop in Africa. It's larger number of crops grown in more diverse agroecological conditions. So the same technology doesn't spread as easily. Mm-hmm. So the original dwarf rice and wheat varieties were pretty easily adapted to local growing conditions all across the Asian rice bowl area. Not so easy to move those. So technological issues very clearly are at work in Africa. But there are also very serious policy problems in Africa. They've been African countries for a long time. Governments have not cooperated with each other, so they haven't allowed cross-border trade between regions, neighboring regions that one has a surplus and one has a deficit. No, we can't do that because we have to be self-sufficient. So really, some inappropriate trade policies have been in place across Africa. Real collapse in Africa in agricultural research and extension in the 70s and 80s. There never was a lot, but it really has fallen. Now it's beginning to come back. We're seeing in the last 5 years or so, that there are really renewed investments in public agricultural research in Africa for African farmers. But I think it's a little early to see a lot of those impacts. We're hopeful that things are changing, but it's slow.
Okay, are there more questions? Yes, all good.
Excuse me?
There's 2 questions here, and somebody up the back, you've got the microphone. Wonderful.
During the talk, here.
Yes.
So during the talk, you were mentioning there's a lot of coverage of BT and GM plants. As a consumer, I have no problem with BT or GM plants. I can eat GM foods. I can wear clothes made of BT cotton. I have no problem with that. What I have a problem with is the fact that using BT or GM crops ties farmer into a one-sided relationship with the supplier of the seeds, people like Monsanto, corporations like Monsanto. And the point is that once you get accustomed to this, you have to buy the seeds only from that company for every cycle. You cannot use the seeds that are being produced by your own farm, because otherwise Monsanto will sue you. So the point is, from a farmer's point of view, why does it make sense to shift to GM or BT? Like, even though there's a short-term gain, long-term, you will suffer the consequences, because effectively you're handing over whatever power you have over your crops to a corporation. And the goal of a corporation is to maximize profit.
I would ask you two questions. How often do you buy a new computer?
Well, I haven't bought a personal computer in ages.
New telephone. I mean, people buy new technologies when they need them. That's a little bit of a joke. I know there is a concern about possible monopoly power being exerted by the big companies that are involved in this game. That's absolutely a legitimate concern. Okay? In any industry, when a very few companies dominate, there's the potential for monopoly pricing, and that's a concern. The solution to monopoly is competition. The solution to monopoly is competition. So that competition needs to come from the public sector. It needs to come from rationalizing regulatory processes so that somebody other than Monsanto can afford to carry a GM crop through a regulatory process. There are a number of potentially very useful innovations that are sitting on shelves in Brazil and in India and because the public sector can't get the products through the regulatory process.
So when the Indian government prevented the release of BT brinjal, which was developed by Mahiko, a small family, well, a large, but a family-owned seed company, Indian-based seed company, that was tragic. Why did they do it? Okay.
Don't know.
Part of the question, though, does the question not partly predicate that farmers are a little bit silly and that they are actually vulnerably trapped into this? I would have thought that with market forces that they would be buying these seed as long as they are beneficial to the farmer, and as soon as they're not beneficial to the farm, then they'll stop buying them, won't they?
Absolutely. Thank you for that prompt. Farmers, this idea that farmers are using their saved seed year after year after year and not buying new seed, I think is erroneous. Okay? There are some crops in some regions where that's the case, but for all hybrid crops, farmers buy seed, new seed, almost every year. Almost every year. Because if you don't buy new seed, you lose yield. Okay? You may take a 25% yield cut if you use saved hybrid seed. So farmers buy new seed because they get a more reliable product. GM farmers are the same with GM crops. My favorite expression about farmers are not stupid.
They're not stupid, but they're being exploited. They're being gamed. You keep the initial entry price low, and then you later increase the prices.
The evidence shows, and I reported.
And by the way, there's competition even in the banking sector. So why did the banking crash happen? Why do all the banks need to get into risky businesses?
I'm sorry.
And the same thing happens everywhere. There is no such thing as a free market. It's always a monopoly or an oligopoly.
Okay, well maybe we can discuss this over an Arab coffee.
Yeah, I think so.
Let's move on to another question. There's lots
Thank
of
you.
hands up. Just down here in the front.
cell phone.
Thank you very much, though, for your point.
Thank you for a very interesting talk and
Yeah.
a bit grimming for the status of women in a lot of countries. I wonder what is in the developed world, in Australia and the States, is the situation when it comes to women in agriculture any better?
For women,
That's a good question.
That's a very interesting question. We don't have a lot of research on women in agriculture in the so-called developed world.
Because I came from Australia, and I hardly.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. Before I was an agricultural economist, I was a little bit of a historian. And it's interesting to look at the transformation of agriculture in Europe since, say, the beginning of the 20th century. Because it's gone through a real transformation. And there were, so I have a colleague who shows a picture of Italian women bent over in a rice field, and they're pulling up weeds, and this was tractors. So women were very, very heavily involved in agriculture as laborers in the early part of the up to the early part of the 20th century, and they have gradually moved out. In France, women were prohibited from inheriting land. In the early part of the 20th century, they were forced out. So, interestingly, I think, women went to school. So men stayed on the farm, and we could say stayed relatively poor. Women went to school, got educated, and transformed the society. So you can't keep us down, whatever you try.
Okay, question here at the front. And was there another hand I saw up over here somewhere?
Just a kind of related question. I'm curious about history and the impact of the internet and access to information as it relates to agricultural development and the gender issues.
Yeah. I think that's a very important. It's a very important issue. I don't think we've yet realized how important improved communications is. But you see, my friend Hansaben has a cell phone.
Exactly.
Yeah. She has a cell phone, and she uses her cell phone to get market information.
Exactly.
Okay? Increasingly, she's using her cell phone to get weather reports. There's potential, I don't know how widespread it is yet, to use cell phones to get extension advice. Okay? So I have a little, if I have a smartphone with a little camera on it, I can take a picture of the bug that's chewing on my cotton, and I send it to the extension agent, and the extension agent, who could be anywhere in the world, says, that bug is X, don't worry about it. Okay? That bug is X, be sure you do something about it. Yeah? So there's real potential for this, for communications technology to make great advances. I think it's a very powerful tool for education, particularly for women who have limited mobility, who can't travel quite so easily. They've got their internet. So once again, you can't keep us down.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think these things could really unlock Africa and get out of some of these traps that a lot of societies, women, all sorts of communities are in. Great. Yeah. Okay, look, I've got, whoa. Okay, rightio. Okay, another question up the back. That's excellent.
I went to med school in South Africa. You mentioned South Africa. And I worked in the public sector hospitals. And after working in Australia and UK, I went back to work in South Africa after about 6 years. And I worked in the largest teaching hospital in Johannesburg, where I trained as well. And the big difference I noticed is we used to treat mostly African patients. They wore better clothes, but the diseases related to malnutrition, micronutrition deficiencies was virtually the same, and I was quite disgusted actually. And I was wondering whether, the UN, the WHO, the FAO could play a bigger role in trying to educate people and transforming your organization from a research to a more practical, hands-on organization.
FAO has recently gone through a renewal process in which we've done two things. We've tried to streamline the number of areas in which we work, okay, so that we can concentrate our efforts, and we are placing much greater importance on ensuring that the work we do is felt at the country level. So working much more closely with our national counterparts to transmit the global knowledge that we produce, to help them devise policies and programs that are more effective, and in some cases providing real technical support to agriculture. We don't do a lot of hands-on work ourselves. It's just not something that we have the capacity to do. But we're trying to be much more effective working with the governments in the area to ensure that farmers on the ground are being reached. I think, it's easy to be negative about Africa, and you can be, it's discouraging sometimes. But I think there are real signs that things are turning around there. I think the current generation of African leaders seems to me much more proactive, in much more engaged in trying to bring better socioeconomic conditions to their people, trying to get policies in place that foster agricultural growth. We went through a real period where nobody gave agriculture much attention. It was considered a kind of dying sector, and those people will never change, and we'll just let them carry on. But I think in the last 5-10 years, there's been a renewed recognition of the importance of agriculture in providing food for everybody. The price spikes of 2008, I think, were a real wake-up call for lots of countries, that they need to get their agricultural sectors moving. And I think there's a renewed appreciation that where you have the majority of your population still working in agriculture, the majority of your poor people in agriculture, and the majority of your hungry people in agriculture, you need to do something about agriculture. And so I think we're beginning to see some change in Africa. At least I'm very hopeful, and I hope that FAO and the rest of the UN system can be supportive of that.
That's an excellent note to end. Thank you very much, Terri.